What you're about to see will make you question everything you thought you knew about bullying. Because when 17-year-old Paige Walker stood over 3 unconscious boys in Westfield Academy's bathroom, blood on her knuckles and fury in her eyes, this wasn't about lunch money or social status. This was about something far more sinister, something that had been lurking in the shadows of their small Connecticut town for months. The security footage shows it all in devastating clarity. Tyler Johnson, 6'2" and captain of the wrestling team, crumpling to the tile floor after a perfectly executed ridge hand strike to his solar plexus. Zachary Thompson, the school's star quarterback, unconscious before his head hit the sink from a spinning heel kick that would make UFC fighters weep with envy. And Blake Anderson, the quiet genius who could hack into any system, curled in the corner after discovering that being smart doesn't protect you from a girl who's been training in Shotokan karate since she was 7 years old. But here's what the cameras couldn't capture: the real reason this bathroom became a battleground. Because if you think this story is about a shy girl finally snapping against her tormentors, you're about to discover just how wrong you can be. The truth is far more terrifying, and it starts with a man who should have been protecting these children. If you've ever felt like something was wrong but couldn't quite put your finger on it, if you've ever noticed an adult paying just a little too much attention to the vulnerable kids, drop a comment and share your story. Sometimes the most important conversations happen when we're brave enough to speak up. And supporting content that exposes predators helps keep our communities safer. 3 hours before Paige Walker's fists met teenage faces in that bathroom, she was sitting in her AP psychology class, listening to Mr. Jonathan Harrison explain trauma bonding with the kind of enthusiasm that should have raised red flags. But Harrison was good at what he did. 42 years old, distinguished gray at his temples, wire-rimmed glasses that made him look scholarly rather than predatory. He'd been teaching at Westfield Academy for 8 months, long enough to identify his targets, but not long enough for anyone to recognize the pattern. Madison Walker, Paige's 15-year-old sister, sat 3 rows behind her in that same classroom, taking notes about attachment theory while having no idea she was studying her own psychological profile. Madison had all the markers Harrison looked for: divorced parents, financial stress, a desperate need for validation from authority figures. She was perfect. What Madison didn't know was that her older sister had been watching Harrison for weeks, documenting his behavior, mapping his movements, building a case that would make federal prosecutors salivate. Because Paige Walker wasn't just any protective sister, she was a girl who'd learned early that the world was dangerous, especially for pretty blonde teenagers with sad eyes and empty bank accounts. The Walker sisters had moved to Westfield 6 months ago after their mother's messy divorce and subsequent mental breakdown, landing in a town where everyone knew everyone, except nobody really knew them. Their rental house sat at the end of Maple Street, surrounded by McMansions they'd never afford. A constant reminder that they were outsiders in a place that worshipped old money and older secrets. Paige had adapted by becoming invisible. Straight A's. No social media presence. Martial arts training at a strip mall dojo where nobody asked questions about payment plans. She'd learned that survival meant preparation, and preparation meant understanding your enemies before they understood you, which is exactly why she'd enrolled in Harrison's psychology class, despite already having enough credits to graduate early. Madison, however, had taken a different approach. She'd tried to fit in. Student council, drama club, staying after school for extra help with teachers who seemed so caring, so invested in her success. Teachers like Mr. Harrison, who made time for one-on-one sessions where they discussed her home situation and how trauma could be processed through trusted adult relationships. The red flags started small. Harrison asking Madison about her living situation, her relationship with their absent father, whether she felt safe at home. Then came the casual touches, a hand on her shoulder during difficult lessons, a brief hug after she'd shared something particularly vulnerable in class. Always professional, always with plausible deniability, always just enough to test boundaries without crossing obvious lines. But Paige noticed everything, because she'd been trained to notice, not just by her karate sensei, who'd taught her that awareness was more important than technique, but by life itself, which had shown her repeatedly that the most dangerous predators wore the most convincing masks. The first concrete evidence came on a Tuesday morning in October, when Paige decided to arrive at school early and found Harrison's classroom door slightly ajar. Inside, she heard her sister's voice, shaky and uncertain, responding to questions that made Paige's blood run cold. "Tell me more about the break-in last year," Harrison was saying, his voice gentle but probing. "How did it make you feel when strange men were in your personal space? Do you still have nightmares about feeling vulnerable?" Paige pressed herself against the hallway wall, listening as Madison shared details she'd never told anyone, not their mother, not the police, not even Paige herself. Details about waking up to find their apartment ransacked, about the violation of having strangers touch her belongings, about the lasting fear that nowhere was truly safe. "It's important that you feel comfortable sharing these experiences," Harrison continued. "Trauma processing requires a safe relationship with a trusted adult, someone who can help you work through these complex emotions." "Have you ever felt that kind of safety with an adult male, Madison?" The question hung in the air like poison gas, and Paige understood with crystalline clarity that she was listening to a predator at work. This wasn't therapy. It was grooming. Harrison was mapping Madison's psychological vulnerabilities, identifying the exact pressure points that would make her susceptible to manipulation. But here's where the story takes its first turn, because when Paige Walker decided to investigate Mr. Jonathan Harrison, she discovered that she wasn't the first person to notice his behavior. She was just the first person with the skills and determination to do something about it. The school's computer lab became her war room, staying late under the pretense of working on college applications while actually diving deep into public records, social media histories, and employment databases. What she found made her stomach turn and her fists clench with barely controlled rage. Harrison had been teaching for 18 years across 7 different states, and in every single location. His tenure had ended with either his sudden resignation or quietly negotiated departure right before the school year concluded, always preceded by vague complaints about inappropriate relationships with students that were never formally investigated. The pattern was sickeningly consistent. Harrison would target girls from broken homes, girls who needed father figures, girls who could be isolated from their support systems through carefully orchestrated psychological manipulation. He'd build trust, create dependency, then escalate the relationship until he'd extracted what he wanted. When complaints surfaced, he'd claim the girls were troubled, seeking attention, misinterpreting his professional concern for something inappropriate. And it worked, because teenage girls from difficult backgrounds aren't considered credible witnesses, especially when they're accusing respected male teachers with sterling professional reputations. But Paige Walker wasn't planning to file a complaint. She was planning to end him. The challenge was evidence, because Harrison was experienced enough to avoid obvious mistakes. He didn't text students inappropriately, didn't meet them outside school property, didn't leave digital fingerprints that could be traced back to criminal behavior. Everything happened in person, behind closed doors, in conversations that could be explained away as legitimate educational or therapeutic interactions. That's when Paige realized she needed help, not from adults who would demand proof she didn't have, but from someone with skills she lacked. Someone like Blake Anderson, whose reputation for hacking into the school's computer system was legend among students, even if administrators couldn't prove it. Blake was an obvious target for Harrison's manipulation, brilliant but socially awkward, desperate for male approval, vulnerable to anyone who showed interest in his computer skills. But Blake was also exactly the kind of person who could help Paige gather the evidence she needed. Approaching him required delicate psychology. Blake trusted no one and suspected everyone of wanting to use his abilities for their own benefit, which, Paige had to admit, was exactly what she planned to do. The difference was that she was honest about it. "I need to show you something," she told him one afternoon, cornering him in the library where he always sat alone, surrounded by programming textbooks and energy drink cans. "Something about Mr. Harrison that you're not going to want to believe." Blake looked up from his laptop screen, suspicious and slightly annoyed. "What kind of something?" "The kind that explains why he's been so interested in your family situation lately," Paige replied, watching his expression change from irritation to concern. "The kind that explains why he keeps asking you about your parents' work schedules and whether you feel understood at home." The color drained from Blake's face because he'd been having those exact conversations with Harrison for weeks. Conversations he'd thought were signs of genuine teacher interest in his well-being. Conversations that suddenly felt much more sinister when viewed through Paige's lens of suspicion. "You're wrong," Blake said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Mr. Harrison is just trying to help me with college applications. He said my personal essay needed more emotional depth." "Emotional depth about what?" "Specifically," Paige asked gently. "Let me guess. He wanted you to write about feeling isolated, about not connecting with your peers, about needing guidance from mature adult mentors." Blake's laptop screen reflected in his glasses as he processed the implications, because, yes, those had been Harrison's exact suggestions. Suggestions that had felt caring and insightful at the time, but now felt like something much darker. "What do you want from me?" Blake asked finally. "I want you to help me protect my sister," Paige replied, "and in the process, maybe protect yourself too." That's when Blake made a decision that would change everything, not just for the Walker sisters, but for every student who'd been marked as prey by a predator in educators' clothing. He agreed to help Paige investigate Harrison, using his technical skills to uncover evidence that would be impossible to explain away or dismiss. The first discovery came within 24 hours, when Blake hacked into the school's internal email system and found correspondence between Harrison and the principal that made both teenagers sick to their stomachs. Regarding the Walker girl, Harrison had written just 3 weeks earlier, "She's responding well to our counseling sessions. Her background trauma makes her an ideal candidate for intensive one-on-one therapeutic intervention. I believe we could make significant progress if we could arrange for after-school sessions in a more private setting." The principal's response was even more damning. "Whatever you think is best, Jonathan. The family seems grateful for your attention to Madison's needs. Just make sure we have proper documentation for any extended contact." Documentation that existed, forms signed by their mother during orientation week, buried in stacks of paperwork about everything from lunch programs to emergency contacts. Forms that gave Harrison permission for individual academic and emotional support sessions as needed for student success. Forms their mother had signed without reading, because she'd been overwhelmed by the divorce, exhausted from working 2 jobs, and grateful that someone at Madison's new school was taking special interest in her daughter's well-being. Forms that Harrison was now using as legal cover for isolating Madison from her support system. This is evidence, Blake breathed, staring at the email chain. This is actual evidence of grooming behavior. It's a start, Paige agreed. But it's not enough. We need more than emails and permission slips. We need proof of what he's actually doing to her. That's when Blake made a suggestion that would escalate everything to a level neither of them had anticipated. What if we set up our own surveillance? I can install hidden cameras, audio recording equipment. We can document everything he says and does. That's illegal, Paige pointed out. So is what he's doing to your sister, Blake replied. The question is whether you want to stop him or just report him to people who won't believe you. It was a fair point, and it highlighted the impossible position they were in. Traditional channels of reporting had failed Harrison's previous victims because the system was designed to protect adults, not children. School administrators prioritized avoiding scandals over protecting students. Law enforcement required evidence that teenage girls couldn't safely obtain without exposing themselves to further victimization. But Paige Walker had something Harrison's previous victims hadn't. A sister who was willing to fight dirty, and technical support from someone with the skills to gather evidence without putting Madison at additional risk. What would we need to do? Paige asked. Blake's eyes lit up with the kind of focus he usually reserved for coding projects. We'd need to identify where he's taking her for these counseling sessions, map out the locations, figure out his patterns, then install equipment that can't be detected or traced back to us. And then we wait for him to incriminate himself on camera. It sounded simple, but Paige had learned that nothing involving predators was ever simple. Harrison had been perfecting his techniques for nearly 2 decades. He wasn't going to make obvious mistakes just because 2 teenagers decided to play detective. But he also hadn't counted on facing someone like Paige Walker, a girl who'd been forced to grow up fast, who understood that sometimes the only way to protect the people you love is to become something dangerous yourself. The surveillance operation began the following Monday, with Blake using his lunch periods to install pinhole cameras in the empty classroom Harrison had been using for Madison's sessions. The room was perfect for predatory behavior, isolated at the end of a hallway, soundproofed for band practice, with only one entrance that Harrison could monitor. But it was also perfect for surveillance, because Blake could access the maintenance passages that ran behind the walls, installing equipment that would be invisible to casual inspection but would capture everything that happened inside. The first recorded session made both teenagers understand that they were dealing with something far worse than inappropriate touching or boundary violations. Harrison was conducting a systematic psychological dismantling of Madison's sense of self and safety, using clinical techniques to make her dependent on his approval and terrified of losing his support. "Your mother seems overwhelmed lately." Harrison's voice came through crystal clear on the recording. "How does it feel to know that your emotional needs are just another burden for her to carry?" Madison's response was barely audible. "I try not to bother her with my problems." "That's very mature of you," Harrison continued. "But maturity shouldn't mean suffering in silence. Everyone needs someone they can trust completely, someone who understands them without judgment. Do you feel like you have that person in your life?" "I thought I did," Madison whispered. "But lately it feels like everyone's too busy or too stressed to really listen." "That must be incredibly lonely," Harrison said, his voice dripping with manufactured sympathy. especially for someone as sensitive and intelligent as you are. Most people your age can't handle the kind of emotional complexity you're dealing with. It takes a special relationship with someone who really understands trauma to process these experiences safely. Paige had to stop the recording 3 times, not because the technology failed, but because she couldn't listen to her sister being systematically broken down without wanting to kick down the door and end Harrison's life with her bare hands. But she forced herself to keep listening, because understanding Harrison's methods was the only way to build a case strong enough to destroy him permanently. The pattern became clear over multiple sessions. Harrison was isolating Madison from her family by convincing her that they couldn't understand her trauma. He was positioning himself as the only adult who truly got her situation. He was creating artificial crises that only he could solve, making Madison feel like she needed his guidance for basic emotional survival. And it was working, because Madison was 15, dealing with legitimate trauma, and desperate for someone who made her feel understood and protected. By the 3rd week of surveillance, Harrison had escalated to physical contact. Nothing that could be called sexual assault, but carefully calculated touches designed to normalize his physical presence in Madison's personal space. A hand on her back during difficult conversations, fingers brushing hers when he handed her tissues for tears he'd deliberately provoked, standing closer than necessary when reviewing her writing assignments. "He's testing boundaries," Blake observed, his voice tight with anger as they reviewed the latest footage. "Seeing how much physical contact she'll accept before she objects." "How long before he escalates further?" Paige asked. Based on the pattern with his previous victims, Blake had been researching Harrison's history with the same obsessive thoroughness he applied to programming. "Probably 2 more weeks. Maybe less if he thinks she's ready." That's when Paige made a decision that would set everything else in motion. She couldn't wait for Harrison to incriminate himself further. The evidence they had was damning, but not criminal, and every day they delayed was another day Madison was being psychologically destroyed by someone who'd perfected the art of institutional child abuse. "We need to force his hand," Paige told Blake. "Make him do something obviously criminal that can't be explained away." "How?" "By making him think he's losing control of the situation. Predators make mistakes when they feel threatened." Blake looked at her with new respect, because he was beginning to understand that Paige Walker wasn't just a protective sister. She was a strategist who'd been thinking 3 moves ahead from the beginning. "What did you have in mind?" he asked. "We're going to make Harrison believe that Madison told someone about their sessions, someone who might report him if he doesn't act fast to secure her silence." "That's dangerous," Blake pointed out. "If he feels cornered, he might hurt her." "He might," Paige agreed, "unless someone else gets to him first." That's when Blake understood that the surveillance operation had never been about gathering evidence for the authorities. It had been about gathering intelligence for a much more direct form of justice. Because Paige Walker had learned something important from her years of martial arts training, sometimes the best defense is a perfectly executed offense. And she was about to demonstrate exactly what that looked like when 17 years of careful preparation met 18 years of unpunished predatory behavior. The trap was set for Friday afternoon, when Blake would accidentally let slip to Tyler Johnson that Madison had been telling people about her weird sessions with Mr. Harrison. Tyler, who'd been recruited by Harrison as a potential future predator himself, would immediately report this development to his mentor. And Harrison, faced with the prospect of exposure, would be forced to make a choice: abandon his carefully cultivated victim, or escalate his timeline to secure Madison's silence permanently. Paige was betting her sister's life that he'd choose escalation, because predators don't abandon their prey. They devour it before anyone can take it away. But what Harrison didn't know was that his chosen battleground, the isolated bathroom where he'd planned to corner Madison for a private conversation about keeping secrets, had already been mapped, surveilled, and prepared for a very different kind of encounter. The kind where a 17-year-old girl with 8 years of karate training would be waiting in the shadows, ready to demonstrate that some victims bite back with techniques that could hospitalize grown men. Friday afternoon arrived with the kind of gray autumn sky that matched Paige's mood, heavy with the promise of storms. Madison sat through her classes, unaware that her sister was implementing a plan that would either save her life or destroy their family. At 3:15, exactly as Paige had predicted, Harrison approached Madison at her locker with the kind of urgent concern that had been his signature throughout their grooming relationship. "Madison, we need to talk," he said, his voice carrying just enough authority to make her feel like she had no choice. "There's been some concerning talk about our counseling sessions. People are misunderstanding the nature of our work together." Madison's face went pale, because she'd been dreading this moment since their sessions began. She'd known, on some level, that there was something wrong about the secrecy, the isolation, the way Harrison made her feel special and vulnerable simultaneously. "I haven't told anyone anything inappropriate," she said quietly. "I believe you," Harrison replied, "but perception matters, and we need to address this situation before it gets out of hand. Can you meet me in the East Wing bathroom in 5 minutes? We need privacy for this conversation." It wasn't really a question, and Madison nodded because she'd been trained to trust authority figures, especially ones who'd positioned themselves as her primary emotional support system. What Madison didn't see was her sister, positioned at the end of the hallway, watching the entire interaction through the kind of cold fury that had been building for weeks. What Harrison didn't see was Blake, hidden in the maintenance area, activating recording equipment that would capture everything about to happen in that bathroom. And what none of them saw were Tyler Johnson, Zachary Thompson, and Blake's backup system. 3 boys who had been manipulated into believing they were about to participate in an intervention to help a troubled teacher deal with a student who was making false accusations. The pieces were all in position: predator and prey, protector and evidence, manipulation and justice, all converging on a tiled room that would become the stage for a confrontation that would end with unconscious teenagers and a very different kind of viral video. Because, in exactly 7 minutes, Paige Walker would step out of the shadows and demonstrate that sometimes the most dangerous person in any room is the one everyone underestimated. The bathroom door closed with an echo that would haunt Madison Walker's nightmares for years to come, but not for the reasons anyone expected. Harrison's voice dropped to the intimate tone he'd perfected over 18 years of predatory behavior. "Madison, I need you to understand something very important about loyalty and trust." But his words were cut short by the sound of 3 teenage boys bursting through the door. Tyler leading with the kind of misguided righteousness that made him perfect for manipulation. Zachary and Blake following, because loyalty meant never questioning your friend's decisions. "Madison," Tyler called out, his voice carrying the authority he'd learned from Harrison himself. "You need to stop lying about Mr. Harrison. We know what you've been saying." The confusion on Madison's face was genuine, because she hadn't been saying anything to anyone. But Harrison's expression shifted from concern to calculation, because he realized that the situation was spiraling beyond his control, and spiraling situations required decisive action. "Boys, this isn't appropriate," Harrison began, but his protest lacked conviction. Because this was actually perfect. 3 teenage witnesses who could testify that Madison had been acting irrationally, making wild accusations, clearly disturbed and seeking attention through false claims. That's when the bathroom door opened one final time, and Paige Walker stepped into frame like an avenging angel with 8 years of martial arts training and a sister to protect. "Actually," she said, her voice carrying the kind of calm that precedes hurricanes, "I think this is exactly appropriate." The silence in that bathroom stretched like a taut wire. 4 teenage bodies between a predator and his prey. While 17-year-old Paige Walker calculated angles, distances, and the exact amount of force needed to end a nightmare that had been building for months. Tyler Johnson turned first, his wrestler's instincts recognizing threat, even when his conscious mind couldn't process what he was seeing. "Paige, what are you doing here?" "Protecting my sister," she replied, her voice carrying the kind of certainty that made smart people step aside. "The question is, what are you doing here?" "Tyler, did Mr. Harrison tell you Madison was spreading lies about him?" The confusion on Tyler's face was answer enough, because he'd been told exactly that. Fed a story about a troubled girl making false accusations against a caring teacher who just needed help containing the situation before it destroyed an innocent man's career. "She's been telling people things," Tyler said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Mr. Harrison said she's having emotional problems, making up stories for attention." "What kind of stories?" Paige asked, taking a step closer, behind Tyler. She could see Madison pressed against the wall, Harrison's hand on her shoulder in a gesture that looked protective but felt possessive. "Stories about private meetings," Zachary answered, his quarterback confidence wavering as he processed the scene. "About inappropriate conversations." Mr. Harrison explained that she's dealing with trauma from her parents' divorce, that she's confused about appropriate adult support. Did he also explain why he chose an isolated bathroom for this conversation? Paige asked. Why he needed 3 athletic boys to corner one 15-year-old girl, why he's been recording these private meetings for his personal collection. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees, because Blake Anderson, hidden in the maintenance area with his recording equipment, suddenly understood that he hadn't been helping gather evidence against Madison. He'd been documenting Harrison's crimes. "That's not true," Tyler said, but his voice cracked on the words. "Mr. Harrison wouldn't—" "Wouldn't what?" Paige interrupted. "Wouldn't target vulnerable teenage girls, wouldn't use psychological manipulation to isolate them from their families, wouldn't recruit teenage boys to help him silence victims when they started talking." Harrison finally spoke, his voice carrying the authority he'd cultivated over 18 years of institutional predation. "Paige, you're clearly as disturbed as your sister. This intervention is necessary to help Madison process her trauma appropriately. These boys are here to witness that she's been making false accusations." "Blake," Paige called out, her voice cutting through Harrison's manipulation like a blade. "Play the recording from Tuesday, the one where Mr. Harrison explains how Madison's vulnerability makes her perfect for intensive one-on-one therapy." The sound system crackled to life, Harrison's own voice filling the bathroom with damning clarity. "Your emotional needs are just another burden for her to carry. Everyone needs someone they can trust completely. It takes a special relationship with someone who really understands trauma." Tyler's face went white as he recognized the calculated grooming techniques hidden beneath caring language. Zachary took an unconscious step backward, his moral compass finally pointing toward true north. But Harrison's expression shifted from authority to desperation, because he realized that his carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. "That recording is taken out of context," Harrison snapped. These girls have obviously manipulated the audio to support their delusional accusations. Blake, Page said again, show them the email to Principal Morrison about arranging private after-school sessions. Show them the research into previous schools where female students mysteriously stopped attending classes. The bathroom's overhead speaker crackled again, this time with Harrison's own written words. Her background trauma makes her an ideal candidate for intensive one-on-one therapeutic intervention. We could make significant progress if we could arrange for after-school sessions in a more private setting. That's when Tyler Johnson, captain of the wrestling team and unwitting accomplice to predatory behavior, made a choice that would define the rest of his life. Instead of defending the teacher who'd manipulated him, he turned to face Harrison with the kind of righteous fury that comes from realizing you've been used. "You told us she was lying," Tyler said, his voice building from whisper to roar. "You told us she was making false accusations. You made us think we were helping protect you from a troubled kid." "You were helping," Harrison replied, but his composure was cracking like ice under pressure. "You're still helping. These recordings prove nothing except that I was providing appropriate therapeutic support to students who needed guidance." "Appropriate?" Zachary's voice carried the disbelief of someone whose entire worldview was restructuring in real time. "You recorded private sessions with teenage girls. You isolated them from their families. You recruited us to intimidate them into silence." Harrison's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the calculation, entitlement, and rage that had driven 18 years of institutional child abuse. "You stupid boys don't understand the complexity of therapeutic relationships. Madison needed intensive intervention, and her sister's interference has compromised months of careful work." "Careful work," Page repeated, her voice deadly quiet. "Is that what you call grooming vulnerable teenage girls? Is that what you called it in Colorado, when Sarah Mitchell disappeared, or in Oregon, when Jennifer Walsh stopped coming to school after reporting your inappropriate behavior?" The silence that followed was deafening, because Harrison's face revealed that Page had done her research, that she knew about the trail of victims he'd left across 7 states, that his carefully maintained professional reputation was about to become evidence in a federal investigation. "You can't prove anything," Harrison said, but his voice carried the desperation of a cornered predator. "These recordings are inadmissible. The emails are taken out of context. Those girls from previous schools were troubled, seeking attention, making false accusations." "Actually," Blake Anderson's voice came through the speaker system, "we can prove everything, because I've been recording this entire conversation, and it's being live-streamed to the FBI's Crimes Against Children unit." The bathroom door burst open as federal agents flooded in, badges gleaming, weapons drawn, voices commanding everyone to freeze and show their hands. Harrison's world ended not with violence, but with the metallic click of handcuffs and the reading of Miranda rights. "Jonathan Harrison, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit child exploitation, using interstate commerce to facilitate crimes against children, and violation of federal stalking statutes." The next hour blurred past in a kaleidoscope of statements, evidence collection, and the systematic dismantling of an 18-year pattern of institutional predation. Harrison's laptop revealed terabytes of surveillance footage, psychological profiles of potential victims, and correspondence with a network of like-minded predators who'd been operating in schools across the country. What the investigation uncovered was even more horrifying than anyone had imagined. Harrison hadn't been working alone. He was part of a sophisticated network that included teachers in 12 states, sharing techniques, trading information about vulnerable students, and even arranging transfers when one location became too risky. They called themselves mentors and believed they were providing guidance that families couldn't understand. The digital evidence revealed chat rooms where they discussed psychological manipulation tactics, forums where they shared photos and videos of their victims, encrypted communications detailing how to identify the perfect targets. Some victims were as young as 12. Others had been groomed for years before aging out of their preferred demographic. Tyler, Zachary, and Blake weren't arrested because they'd been victims too, manipulated by someone who'd perfected the art of psychological control. Instead, they became witnesses, their testimony crucial to understanding how Harrison had recruited teenagers to unknowingly participate in his crimes. "He made us feel special," Tyler explained to the FBI agent taking his statement. "Like we were mature enough to help with serious adult problems. He said Madison was troubled, that she needed our help to stay safe." "That's how predators work," Agent Sarah Martinez replied gently. "They identify good kids with strong moral compasses and twist those qualities to serve their purposes. You're not responsible for his manipulation." The revelation that Harrison had been grooming the boys, too, not sexually, but psychologically, turning them into unwitting accomplices, sent shockwaves through Westfield Academy. Parents demanded answers about how a predator had operated so openly for months. Students questioned every interaction they'd had with authority figures. The community grappled with the uncomfortable truth that evil often wears the most convincing masks. Blake's technical skills proved invaluable to the investigation, his recordings and hacked emails forming the foundation of a case that would ultimately lead to 37 arrests across 14 states. The network Harrison had been part of included teachers, coaches, counselors, and administrators, all using their positions of authority to identify, groom, and exploit vulnerable children. Madison Walker spent 3 days in the hospital, not for physical injuries, but for psychological evaluation and the beginning of real therapy designed to undo months of calculated manipulation. Her recovery would take time, but she was surrounded by genuine support, family who loved her, friends who believed her, and a community that finally understood the difference between protection and predation. Paige Walker became something she'd never expected, a hero. Not because she'd used martial arts to neutralize a threat, but because she'd used intelligence, preparation, and strategic thinking to expose institutional corruption that had been hidden for decades. The case made national headlines when prosecutors revealed the scope of the network. Operation Safe Harbor resulted in the largest educational predator bust in American history. Harrison's testimony, given in exchange for a reduced sentence, helped authorities identify over 200 victims across multiple states, some who'd never reported their experiences, others who'd been dismissed or silenced. 6 months later, Westfield Academy implemented new policies requiring background checks, mandated reporting training, and transparent oversight of all one-on-one student interactions. Harrison's arrest had triggered a federal review of private school safety protocols that would protect children nationwide. Tyler Johnson founded a peer education program teaching students to recognize manipulation and grooming behavior. Zachary Thompson used his platform as student body president to advocate for victim support services. Blake Anderson channeled his technical skills into developing digital safety tools for vulnerable teenagers. The Walker sisters' rental house on Maple Street no longer felt like exile, because they'd discovered that belonging isn't about money or social status. It's about community, courage, and the willingness to stand up for what's right, even when the cost feels overwhelming. On a crisp December morning, Paige Walker stood at her graduation podium as valedictorian, looking out at an audience that included federal prosecutors, survivor advocates, and families whose children were safer because 3 teenagers had refused to stay silent. My sister once asked me why I learned martial arts, Paige said, her voice carrying across the auditorium. I told her it was for self-defense, but the truth is, the strongest weapons aren't fists or feet. They're knowledge, preparation, and the courage to use your voice when someone else can't use theirs. To every student listening, trust your instincts. Document everything. Find allies who believe in truth over convenience. And remember that predators count on our silence, but they never count on our intelligence. Because sometimes the quiet ones aren't quiet because they're weak. They're quiet because they're planning something extraordinary. The applause that followed wasn't just recognition of academic achievement. It was a community celebrating the kind of courage that transforms victims into protectors, bystanders into allies, and institutions into guardians of the children they're meant to serve. Harrison received a 25-year federal sentence, his network dismantled. His victims finally heard. His reign of terror ended by a 17-year-old girl who understood that true strength comes not from the ability to hurt others, but from the determination to protect them. And in bathrooms across America, predators now know that their next victim might not be as helpless as they appear. Because Paige Walker's story proved that sometimes the most dangerous person in any room is the one everyone underestimated. If you've ever witnessed something that didn't feel right, if you've ever questioned an adult's behavior around children, your instincts matter more than you know. Share your experiences in the comments, because awareness spreads faster than predators can adapt, and every voice makes it harder for them to operate in silence.